Hi, this is Barb with Recur 360, and today we're going to talk about using variables in recurring invoices. In Recur 360, when you open or create a recurring invoice, you have the ability to use different dynamic date variables that can automatically personalize the invoice each time it renews. In this case, I have a weekly gardening item that says it is for the period of invoice date to day before next invoice date. That means every time this recurring invoice renews for the next period, it will show that the period is September the 17th. That is the next time this will renew through, this is a monthly invoice, so it would show October the 16th as the next date at day before the invoice date. These variables can be used in either the description of line items on recurring invoices or the message area. So in my message, I could say your contract expires on, and I'll scroll down and use one of the dynamic date variables that I created. In this case, I could say it's the last day of the month, 12 months after this invoice date. So that variable will automatically be inserted each time this recurring invoice happens. In the line items, if you are adding a new line item, I can do a maintenance item and then modify the description to use each one of these variables. So this would say maintenance and repair begins on, and I can again use one of the built-in variables that Recur 360 has, which are the invoice date, the invoice due date, the day before the next invoice date, or the next invoice date. Those are automatically pre-built and available in every recurring invoice. If you need a different date variable than those four, you would be able to create your own. That's how we got the last day of the month, 12 months after the invoice date. Or I have a few other variables I've created as well that says the 16th day of the month, 6 months before the invoice date. So let's use that variable inside of this description. And maybe I need another variable and will end on, and then I can create a new dynamic date variable by clicking this and then selecting how that works. Maybe this would be a weekly on the first Wednesday, 3 weeks after the invoice date. So you can get very custom and very specific with those dynamic date variables and how those get calculated each time the recurring invoice happens. Once I create that variable, now it is named in my description list here, and it is the most recent one I did, the Wednesday, 3 weeks after the invoice date. So I'll choose to end it on that and put that variable in there. Now, when I save this, this is now programmed, and every time this recurring invoice happens, these dates get calculated and put into the invoice automatically. So you don't have to modify anything every month to have these dates get personalized on the invoice. Let's tell this recurring invoice that it needs to happen right now so you can see what those look like. So I'm going to backdate the start date to be August 16th, so it will create that recurring invoice now. Then when I press the submit button, that's going to cue that to get created when I press process transactions. So we'll let those transactions process and let it create that recurring invoice. We are able to use those invoice date variables as well when you are creating a new one-time invoice in the system. So if I'm in the invoice center and I choose to create a new one-time invoice, I have two built-in date variables that I can use there, which are the invoice date or the invoice due date. So it's not as common to use the variables inside a one-time invoice because you are creating that on demand and it only happens once. But you do have those two options available to you inside of the one-time invoice. Now that that is finished processing my transactions, I can go back to my invoice center and see this most recent invoice that was created for Sue Jones. And if I open up the detail of it, we're going to see how those dates displayed. So my weekly gardening service for the period of shows 8/17/2022 through 9/16/2022. And then the maintenance and repair begins on 2/16, which was 6 months prior to that invoice date on the 16th. And it will end on 9/17, which is 3 weeks after this invoice date. The message that goes out on that says your contract expires on 8/31 of next year. That's 12 months on the last day of the month after this recurring invoice happened. So that is how those variables look on invoices that go out to clients. One other thing that you can do with these variables as well is change the look of those dates and how they appear. So if I go back to this Sue Jones invoice again, and I maybe don't want the year to display on this date, or in this dynamic date variable, I don't want it to display here. So if I were to modify this and take out those Y portions of that variable. So if I remove all the Ys, which are the year formatting, then now it would simply say the month and day of that variable. I can do the same thing with the other dynamic date variable that I created and have it maybe I only wanted to display the 2-digit year of that format. So then when I save that, now let's backdate that again to the same situation, and we'll have it create another one for this month, and we'll submit that. Then if I press process transactions, that's going to go make another recurring invoice with a slightly different appearance on that date variable. When you are working with any of the date variables, they all work with that same formatting where you can control how many characters display in the date. So if I were to put 2 M's in the month section, because it is month, day, and then year. So if I put 2 M's in here, then it will always have the 2-digit month. And if I put 2 D's in here, then it will have a 2-digit date as well. So you can work with the format of how that displays. And if I look at the results of that, now that my invoice has finished creating, and I go to the invoice center and I see my most recent invoice now, when I look at that, now it just shows no year on the first variable there. So it's still February 16th, but does not have a year displayed. And the end portion now says 9/7 of just a 2-digit year, 2022. So you can get very specific with how those dynamic date variables display to your customers. If you have any other questions, please let us know. You can always go to our support chat and get live help with any of your questions as well. Thanks for watching and have a great day.